Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to our Fellows Public Talk series. I'm Claudia Rizzini, Executive Director of the Fellowship Program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer L. Derr. The environments in which we live shape our health in both subtle and significant ways. These health impacts often stem from political and economic processes that reshape our relationship with the environment. Jennifer's research explores the relationship among medicine, health, environment, and economy in Egypt during the 19th and 20th century. Egypt is not only the site of Jennifer's research, it is one of the places that she has called home since she first lived there almost 30 years ago. As an undergraduate, Jennifer studied biology. This interest in science, particularly how it is made and how it shapes our world, continues to dominate her work as a historian. Jennifer's first book, The Lived Nile, explores the construction of the first dam built on the Nile River and the environmental transformation of rural Egypt that followed its construction. Based on archival research that spans continents, Jennifer crafts this historical narrative through the eyes of Egyptian laborers and rural communities, as well as engineers, businessmen, colonial administrators, and physicians. During her year at Radcliffe, Jennifer is completing The Organ That Traveled the World, a book exploring the history of liver disease in Egypt in the second half of the 20th century. One facet of the environmental change associated with the Nile River was the increased prevalence of parasitic infections, which can cause liver disease. Until recently, Egypt had the highest prevalence of hepatitis C infections in the world. With the liver as a narrative centerpiece, Jennifer's book aims to show how the diseases that afflicted this organ came to shape the practice of medicine and experiences of the post-colonial state in Egypt. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Samantha Mathern, Professor of Philosophy at Harvard University. And now please join me in welcoming Jennifer Derr.
I would like to start today by thanking Claudia for her introduction and for all of you for taking the time to listen to me this afternoon. Despite popular fantasies to the contrary, scholarship is not a venture undertaken by a lone wolf. The work that I do and have always done only happens with the support of a pack. Before beginning today, I would like to offer gratitude, especially to the staff at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, the Radcliffe research partners with whom I've had the pleasure of working, Rana El-Baadani, Dalal Hassan, and Sophie Cooper, my colleagues, the truly unbelievable Radcliffe Fellows, my partner Christian Amarello, and finally, the many, many people with whom I have worked in Egypt who have given so generously of their time and of their experiences to me. I'm here at Radcliffe to write a book about the liver. Now, if you, like many people with whom I think that a book framed around a bodily organ, the liver no less, is an odd project, you would not be counted in the minority. My mission this afternoon is to convince you that not only is this not an odd project, but that the history of the liver in Egypt has much to teach us about the fate of our bodies in the world. In the United States, conversations around liver disease often center on alcohol consumption. In Egypt, the roots of dysfunction are different. Every place has its own landscapes of illness and pain. Liver disease has been a primary attribute of those geographies in Egypt. Experiences of this disease are products of historically specific encounters with parasites and viruses, as well as the structures of medicine, of public health, and of the economy. Two different Arabic words derived from the same root frame my current research. The word kebed refers to the liver, and kebed to a state of suffering. Liver disease has left no one unscathed in Egypt. From the early decades of the 20th century, at least half of the population was infected with the parasitic disease schistosomiasis, one form of which can cause liver damage. When, in the early 1990s, it became possible to test for hepatitis C, it was determined that between 14 and 20% of Egyptians were infected with the virus, which at the time was more than any country in the world. Now, since 1996, a part of my life has been lived in Egypt. In the past 30 years, Egypt has been a place where I have studied and I have performed research. It has also been the world of my everyday life. The genesis of this book project is in the relationships that have made up this everyday. Now, this afternoon, I will guide you through an arc of Egyptian history. This brings together a portion of the analysis that frames my first book, The Lived Nile, and the research and insights that inform the new project that I'm working on here at Radcliffe. My objective is to demonstrate two things. First, I aim to illustrate how the particularities of our bodily health are determined by time, place, and economy, in addition to questions of class, gender, and race. In short, I want to show you how bodies themselves exist as historical formations. The second objective of this exploration is connected to the liver itself. As a historian, the projects that I undertake, they begin in different places. Sometimes the beginning is a person, a place, or an event. Other times it is a pivotal historical period. My current research asks how our interpretations of history might differ if we allow the body to function as a point of departure and also a form of evidence. The roots of liver disease in Egypt are both economic and also environmental. One place to begin a historical investigation is with the country's agricultural economy in the 19th century. A primary feature of this economy was cotton cultivation. The British had occupied Egypt in 1882, and British colonial administrators dominated the Egyptian state until 1923. The production of cotton began during the first decades of the 19th century. It became this cornerstone of the economy during the British colonial period. Now, it was the transformation of the Nile River itself that enabled cash crop agriculture. Egyptian agriculture depends almost entirely on irrigation for water. As the British were keen to expand cotton production and its export to textile mills in the north of England, the rebuilding of Egypt's irrigation infrastructure became a centerpiece of the colonial project. For millennia, the growing cycles of the country's primary crops had accorded with the temporality of the Nile flood. When its waters arrived each summer, Egyptian cultivators channeled the Nile into large basins that lined the river. Water and fertilizing silt permeated the soils of these basins. Crops were planted in them after the water had been drained. Historically, the most famous, the most well-known of these crops was wheat, which, when Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire, fed the population of its capital in Istanbul. The introduction of widespread cotton cultivation demanded a transformation of this irrigation landscape. Cotton was thirstiest in early summer when the Nile was low. Under the British, the first dam was constructed on the river. This dam, Khazen Aswan, or sometimes anachronistically called the Aswan Low Dam, was completed in 1902, and it was raised twice during the first decades of the 20th century. The waters that were stored by Khazen Aswan made new geographies of rural space. During the season of the flood, when basins had subdivided the fields that lined the rivers, villages had existed as tiny islands. After the dam was built, vast networks of irrigation canals replaced basins in the Nile Delta, which fanned out from Cairo to the Mediterranean Sea, as well as in the northern portions of the Nile Valley. These canals enabled year-round agricultural production and also the cultivation of crops like cotton, which could not be watered according to the seasonality of the flood. Egypt's new agricultural environments only came about through hard labor. It was Egyptian farmers who excavated canals, often by hand or with rudimentary tools. It was these same farmers who cleared these waterways of the Nile silt that clogged them and managed their repair. The introduction of new irrigation methods also transformed what it meant to do the work of agriculture. Farmers spent hours knee or thigh deep in canals, hoisting water to higher ground. The lyrics of one poem recounted the use of a popular irrigation tool that was known as the shadoof. They read, "I tremble like a leaf looking at the stalk of the shadoof. I am weary, my hands are bruised on the wood of the stalk of the shadoof. I am weary, I am weary." In rural villages that depended on the Nile for their water, canals also became centers of village life. Approaching the Nile could be treacherous, especially during the season of the flood. At the turn of the 19th century, when Egyptian villages lacked running water, canals became sites of a whole host of activities. Men labored in these waterways, women fetched water and washed clothes in them, children frolicked in their waters when the temperature soared. In a landscape devoid of cover, they were also sites where people relieved themselves, especially male cultivators who were engaged in the act of irrigation. While canals might have carried the river, they were other than the river in their ecologies. The Nile ran high and fast, especially in the season of the flood. Canals were slow-moving, they were shallow, they were dense with vegetation. These attributes allowed new worlds of animal life to flourish, which included parasites of the Schistosoma genus and the tiny freshwater snails that served as their intermediate hosts. As canals overtook and overwhelmed Egypt's irrigation landscape, the prevalence of the parasitic disease schistosomiasis skyrocketed among rural communities that had access to the new waters that were provided by the dam. Now, human bodies develop schistosomiasis when our unbroken skin is penetrated by schistosoma parasites, which live in bodies of slow-moving fresh water. These parasites begin their lives as eggs, suspended in human feces or urine. When expelled into water, these eggs hatch, releasing free-swimming larvae that penetrate the feet of tiny freshwater snails. These snails are the parasite's intermediate hosts. Schistosoma parasites develop within snails before being released in an organismal form that can penetrate our skin and cause an infection. By the 1930s, in regions of Egypt that were watered by the dam, approximately 60% of the population was infected with schistosomiasis. And in some communities, that infection rate was as high as 90%. Disease was most prevalent among men between their teenage years and middle age because it was these men who did the physical labor of irrigation. Now, as a point of comparison, in areas that continue to practice basin irrigation, rates of infection hovered around 5%. From the early decades of the 20th century, Egypt was renowned for its high rates of schistosomiasis infection. Physicians in the world of tropical medicine flocked to the country. Medical and public health literature, both contemporary and historical, often cite the presence of schistosoma parasites in ancient Egyptian mummies as evidence of a long-standing and persistent pattern of disease in the country. Now, I want to push back quite forcefully against this historical narrative of disease. This narrative is, in fact, deeply deceptive. While schistosomiasis is certainly endemic in Egypt, it was dramatically less prevalent before the construction of the dam, nowhere near the epidemic proportions that began to be recorded in the 1930s. When the history of schistosomiasis is recounted as an ancient history, this framing obscures the disease's more recent and much more violent entanglements with the environmental forms that were produced by colonialism and also the political economy with which it was associated. Now, dams are, in their way, emblematic of our imaginations of infrastructure. Their size, their fixity, their ability to reshape our material worlds, each of these attributes helps us to understand the category as a kind of clear form. Today, I want to think with another sense of the term infrastructure, one that is chemical and operative at the molecular level. In Egypt, beginning in the 1920s, the state used pharmaceutical compounds to construct a chemical infrastructure that was intended to mitigate the effects of the dam on human bodies. It was during this decade that the Egyptian Department of Public Health started to treat schistosomiasis with the compound antimony potassium tartrate, or tartaremetic as it was known locally. During the interwar period, the Egyptian government offered treatment at the country's primary hospital in Cairo and at treatment annexes, like this one that you see above, that were established throughout the countryside. When Egypt had become a quasi-independent state in 1923, the elites who ruled this state were also large landowners, a class whose wealth derived from cotton and who worried about the impact of schistosomiasis on the health of its labor force. A decrease in British power also meant the ascendancy of Egyptian technocrats, scientists, and physicians, all of whom were eager to demonstrate expertise in scientific and medical worlds in which they had been silenced. In 1928, the Public Health Department formed an endemic disease section headed by the eminent and deeply nationalist Egyptian physician Mohammed Khalil. By 1929, the state was treating approximately 250,000 cases of schistosomiasis each year. That number reached nearly 400,000 by the end of the 1940s. Now, from one vantage point, Egypt's program represented a great public health achievement. That the government was able to form and elaborate a mass treatment program in the short days that followed World War I and the official end of the British occupation, this was remarkable. It also highlights the coercion that was part and parcel of public health. In the 1920s, the idea of medical consent remained decades in the future. This was as true in Egypt as it was in the United States. In Egypt, agricultural laborers, sharecroppers, and small farmers existed within a system that was marked by the coercive power of large landowners and local state officials. Because wealthy landowners were deeply enthusiastic about the treatment program, many of the individuals who worked their lands were in turn treated. In the 1940s, the Egyptian state also passed a law which made treatment for schistosomiasis compulsory. The law would not be applied for more than a decade, but in the meantime, the state began to use infection status to determine eligibility for employment and rural relocation, a practice that would persist. Most historical evidence of Egyptians infected with schistosomiasis derives from the records of hospitals and treatment centers. Now, these records are imperfect, as they were usually the records that were kept by physicians. They nonetheless attest to layered experiences of pain. One of those layers was that of disease itself. There are two species of parasite that cause schistosomiasis in Egypt: Schistosoma hematobium and Schistosoma mansoni. Both cause fatigue, fever, aching, cough, and diarrhea in the weeks after infection. Those suffering from Schistosoma hematobium commonly have blood in their urine, and chronic infections can contribute to bladder cancer. The long-term symptoms of Schistosoma mansoni include high blood pressure through the liver, an enlarged spleen, the buildup of fluid in the abdomen, and swollen areas in the esophagus and digestive tract that can rupture and bleed. Importantly, Schistosoma mansoni can also cause liver damage, in which excessive connective tissue, or fibrosis, builds up. This can lead to cirrhosis, to liver failure, and liver cancer. As year-round irrigation transformed the countryside, these symptoms became so commonplace that they came to constitute normative habitations of the body. Treatment itself represented another layer of pain. For many of those treated, it was this pain, rather than cure, that was their primary experience. A month-long series of injections could, in a large proportion of cases, expunge schistosoma parasites and their eggs from the body. That said, the intravenous administration of tartar emetic was difficult. Patients commonly coughed, they sometimes vomited or fainted. Possible side effects included severe muscular pain, toothaches, earaches, and backaches, and pain in the eyes and in the nose. On rare occasions, patients died. From the beginning of this program, quote-unquote compliance was an issue, meaning that most patients did not complete the entire course of injections. There were likely multiple reasons that patients did not return for treatment. Pain was one, the economic hardship of a month without labor was another. Now, I've chosen to use the idea of chemical infrastructure to describe schistosomiasis treatment because the experience of these chemicals was persistent, it was widespread, and it was often futile. This futility sometimes resulting in multiple encounters. Most people treated for the disease were ultimately reinfected with their return to rural life and the same patterns of daily activity and work that had initially made them sick. There was no escaping this threat of reinfection. The British colonial regime had made minimal investments in improving the conditions of life in the countryside. It was only in the 1930s that the quasi-independent Egyptian state began to turn their attention to this project. Villages lacked sufficient clean water and the infrastructure that might have provided it. Most all labor options were in agriculture. Treatment continued apace, and some patients were treated multiple times. In the early years of this campaign, it was thought possible that this approach could affect a decrease in rates of infection. That did not occur, but treatment had become bound up with the state's responsibility to its citizens and also to the demonstration of medical expertise. Ending this treatment would have represented a kind of capitulation. I also want to observe that this was a historical period in which the medical imperative was to treat without consideration for the structural factors that cause disease to appear and to persist. The notion of a chemical infrastructure lays bare the physically operative relationships that connected political economy and the environment to chemical interventions that shaped the bodies of entire communities. While meant to augment the livability of the worlds that the dam shaped, this chemical infrastructure was its own source of persistent pain and futility. In 1952, a group of junior officers in the Egyptian military seized control of the state. In the period that followed, during the presidency of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian state was reorganized according to the principles of an anti-colonial populist authoritarianism. While curtailing political freedoms, Nasser's state actively sought to improve the conditions of daily life among Egypt's poorest citizens. Undoing the colonial structures of Egyptian agriculture was a priority. The state implemented land reform measures and rural health initiatives. And between 1951 and 1963, the number of rural health units, as well as the state budget that was devoted to health care, nearly quadrupled. The battle against disease was central to this program. One of the hallmarks of Nasser's regime was the construction of a second dam on the Nile, the Aswan High Dam. The high dam would permanently end the relationship between agriculture and the flood in Egypt. Most significantly, the hydroelectricity that it generated would fuel a growing industrial sector, and this was a sector that had not been developed under colonial conditions. Construction on this dam commenced in 1960. The dam flooded for a final time in 1964. It was complete in 1970. As plans to construct the Aswan Dam gathered steam, Egyptian technocrats and physicians anticipated that its completion would also produce an increase in rates of schistosomiasis. In May of 1962, the Egyptian Ministry of Scientific Research sponsored a conference to mark the centennial of the discovery of the disease in Egypt by the German pathologist Theodor Bilharz. Plans were announced to open a new facility dedicated to treatment and research in an agricultural area right outside of Cairo, which was called the Theodor Bilharz Research Institute. This was a collaboration between the Egyptian and the West German governments. It was during the 1950s and 1960s, especially as construction for the dam was underway, that the chemical infrastructure linked to the dammed Nile acquired a second dimension. Global public health institutions, specifically the World Health Organization and the United Nations Children's Fund, began to explore an approach to disease known as vector control. Now, with respect to schistosomiasis, this approach used chemicals to target the freshwater snails that were the parasite's intermediate hosts. Officials at the WHO imagined vector control as a means of eliminating the threat of reinfection that haunted the state's treatment program. Without snails, they reasoned, parasites could not continue to infect human beings. Vector control programs also quite deliberately sidestepped investments in Egyptian medicine. During this period, the policies of the WHO were strongly shaped by those of the US government, which sought to avoid anything stinking of socialist medicine. Chemical and pharmaceutical companies were also important actors in these public health institutions. For West Germany and the United States, vector control experiments were also opportunities to promote national industry. West Germany was particularly aggressive in its support for Bayer. Beginning in the 1950s and intensifying during the 1960s, the WHO and UNICEF conducted field experiments in which Egyptian workers dumped enormous quantities of chemicals in irrigation canals in an endeavor to kill snails and reduce the prevalence of disease. These field experiments were also supported by the US Navy, which maintained a medical research lab in Cairo, and whose interest in schistosomiasis had been piqued when US soldiers were infected while fighting in the Pacific during World War II. Vector control was largely unsuccessful in Egypt. The vastness of Egypt's irrigation landscape made it impossible to treat chemically. Now, had chemicals indeed been applied on a nationwide scale, the resulting toxicity would have likely been paralyzing. However, in the approach of the day, it was cost and not toxicity that thwarted this project. Moreover, the prohibitive cost of vector control, this was not a late-breaking discovery, but rather it was discussed openly in the planning and implementation of these experiments. The use of Egypt as a test site, and this has a deep legacy in the colonial world, this was good business for Bayer. With its high prevalence of schistosomiasis, chemical companies were drawn to Egypt for what it might do for their profits more generally. While environmental chemicals would never acquire the extensiveness or the fixity attached to injection-based treatments, they illustrate the fundamental instability of the maintenance of any form of chemical infrastructure, its relationship to the market. Now, I would like to pause here and move in a different direction. The historical arc that I just recounted is one that draws from state and institutional archives in Egypt, Europe, and the US, as well as from oral histories that I've collected. As historians, we are trained to ask questions of the sources that inform our work. Why was a particular source produced, and who was its intended audience? What might be the reasons to question the information that we find? In my own research, I also think with evidence that derives from the body. In Egypt, these records became their own kind of historical source in the years that followed the construction of the dam. In this next portion of my talk, I want to invite you to consider this evidence with me and how it might enrich our interpretations of history. The first record that I'll show you is that of a liver with a particular pattern of disease. In 1904, a pathologist who was working in Egypt, William St. Clair Simers, documented the architecture of liver fibrosis caused by the implementation of schistosoma eggs in the liver. This occurs when eggs travel to the liver via the portal vein and are lodged in the small vessels within the organ, where they cause inflammatory collections of immune cells. When these collections of cells subside, the organ begins to repair its own tissue, which can lead to extended and irreversible fibrosis. In the short years after Simers' encounter, it was determined that the fibrosis that he had identified was caused by the eggs of the Schistosoma mansoni species specifically. In the early 20th century, infection with this species was limited to certain regions of the Nile Delta and was this rarer than that with Schistosoma hematobium, which existed throughout the country. Liver damage correlated with geography, meaning that, again, the bodies of Egyptian cultivators were harmed differently depending on where they lived in the country. That schistosoma parasites were geographically distinct and caused different patterns of disease meant that bodies came to play the role of archive. Liver damage in the form of Simers' fibrosis was also a kind of omen in that it was a primary indication of environmental change. In the 1930s, James Allen Scott, who was a parasitologist at the Rockefeller Foundation, conducted an extensive nationwide survey of the prevalence of infection with both species of schistosoma parasites. Scott wondered at the time whether the environmental changes produced by damming the Nile were causing Schistosoma mansoni to spread beyond the regions in which it had been historically concentrated. His hunch proved to be correct. In the years that followed Scott's survey, Egyptian physicians began to observe signs of liver disease outside of the regions in which the parasite had once thrived. In the second half of the 20th century, Schistosoma mansoni and its connected liver damage eventually replaced Schistosoma hematobium as the most common cause of disease in Egypt. Images of the liver not only came to represent a shifting pattern of disease, but they also point to a specific relationship among class, race, and power. In colonial Egypt, pathology was a popular discipline, and its specialists continued to produce high-profile research well into the 20th century. Physicians usually performed this research on the bodies of working-class Egyptian men who had passed in the hospital. There is no indication that these autopsies were consented to. While patients might have sought out treatment in hospitals of their own volition, once within the system, their bodies were never again entirely their own. In the aftermath of their deaths, images, and especially photographs, of their organs circled the globe as evidence of tropical disease. And this was especially the case when, on a global scale, the construction of large dams really gained speed and Schistosoma mansoni began to spread to other parts of the globe. The next piece of bodily evidence that I would like to think with is not a visual piece of evidence, but rather derives from the oral histories that I've recorded. As liver disease became more common, Egyptian physicians reported encountering this disease in their examinations of patients. Palpations of the liver revealed inflammation. Patients began to present more frequently with severe jaundice. Physicians mostly understood these symptoms as signs of infection with Schistosoma mansoni. However, they were also uneasy, worried that there was something about this epidemic of liver disease that they did not yet fully grasp. To understand what physicians observed, I want to return to the first section of my talk, in which I described the chemical infrastructure that was schistosomiasis treatment. That infrastructure expanded greatly during the 1950s and 1960s with the elaboration of public medicine and rural health in Egypt. In 1962, Brian McGrath, who was a consultant for the WHO, described the well-oiled machine that was the state's treatment program in Cairo. Now, the consultant watched an operation in the endemic diseases hospital in Shubra, a neighborhood of Cairo, on the 15th of November, 1962. The skillful doctor began injecting at 9:20 a.m. and completed 504 injections of men, women, and children by 10:10 a.m. Allowing for a 10-minute rest, the time to give these injections was 40 minutes. The average time for each injection was thus just under 5 seconds. This remarkable performance is being repeated at various tempos all over Egypt. Now, I've included McGrath's quote here to make more tangible the temporal intensity of the chemical relationships that I have thus far described. When injection-based interventions began to spread in Egypt, these injections drew Egyptian patients into a new network, this one global. In the middle decades of the 20th century, an increase in the use of injections spread the hepatitis B and hepatitis C viruses. Across the globe, these viruses spread through blood transfusions, through injections, and also other medical procedures. During this period, glass syringes were used, these syringes needing sterilization. For a whole host of reasons, many syringes were not, in fact, sterilized between patients. One of the largest single incidents of hepatitis infection occurred during World War II when the US Army infected large numbers of American soldiers with hepatitis B while vaccinating them for yellow fever. The history that I began my talk with today, that of schistosomiasis treatment, is also the history of infection with hepatitis C in Egypt. The chemical infrastructure that linked bodies to dammed ecologies also tied patients to one another through the transmission of viruses. Because hepatitis C is quiet in the first decades after infection, it moved into the bodies of Egyptian patients without producing externally visible symptoms. Decades later, those who had been infected, often the same working-class Egyptian men who had been liberally treated for schistosomiasis, these men presented with end-stage liver disease. What was complicated is that many of these patients also suffered the very recognizable liver damage caused by schistosomiasis, as well as the less distinctive damage produced by hepatitis C. Abd al-Halim Hafez, Egypt's nightingale, was the most famous casualty of liver failure. A singer and an actor, Halim was one of the Arab world's greatest stars, and this was especially the case during the 1950s and the 1960s. He had been born poor in a village in the Nile Delta and orphaned at a young age. And at the age of 46, Halim died of complications from liver disease in a London hospital, a death that, while attributed to schistosomiasis, might have been hastened by the presence of the hepatitis C virus. In concluding my talk today, I would like to look forward to a set of more contemporary events. In October of 2023, the WHO awarded Egypt gold tier status for its work to eliminate hepatitis C. Egypt is the first country to be given this distinction. In 2013, the FDA had approved a new treatment for the virus, this treatment manufactured by Gilead Sciences. A year later, Egypt began a massive testing and treatment program that existed throughout the country. Over 60 million people in Egypt have been tested for hepatitis C, and more than 4.1 million people have been treated for the disease. This campaign was funded by the authoritarian Egyptian state, and it was organized by a prominent group of Egyptian physicians who have, since the 1990s, been working to build an infrastructure to treat hepatitis. Now, the recounting of this campaign, and I urge you to look at reports of this campaign in the New York Times and Nature and a number of global publications, When this campaign is discussed, its innovation often hinges on the miraculous nature of the drug that was produced by Gilead. What I want to emphasize is that this treatment could only be operationalized on such a large scale because Egyptian physicians had spent decades building a medical infrastructure, and also because the Egyptian government quite aggressively upended the unequal economic relations between a multinational pharmaceutical company and a state in the global south. Nationwide treatment was only possible with the rejection of Gilead's patent application and the local manufacture of generics that treat the disease. When I began my tenure at Radcliffe, I imagined that this campaign and the effective end of hepatitis C in Egypt would function as a kind of natural conclusion to the book that I'm writing. That turns out not to be the case, but that is a story for a different day. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I would like to remind the audience that you can submit questions via the QR code and Slido, what that might be. But I'm going to slide myself into the conversation first. One thing that was really central to the talk was not only the centrality of the body, but of bodily pain and bodily suffering. Yeah. And I wondered if we could explore that a little bit methodologically. So I was struck by the way in which you as a historian and the physicians that you documented in the talk are approaching bodily pain from a third-person perspective, from the outside, and then thinking about what is the first-person perspective and the lived experience of the people who are enduring the suffering. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on how your third-person perspective as a historian relates to the body as evidence that's different from how the physician does, and how you honor the first-person lived experience from the third-person point of view.
That's a great question, and I think it's a really important question in my work more broadly. So one of the issues that I was deeply concerned about when I wrote my first book, which was a book that was centered in the colonial period, was this question of, as a historian, we tend to think about historical subjectivity through categories like class, like politics, like gender, categories that very much think with the mind and the imagination, but don't think with the body. And as I was thinking about this kind of set of environmental changes, I became deeply aware that the bodies and the subjects who I were thinking about were undergoing a significant degree of pain, but that there was a kind of methodological archival problem, right? So, as historians, we often talk about the fact that rural populations, illiterate populations, populations without power, people without power, don't leave the same kind of trace in the archives, right? So there's the kind of inevitable search for historical voice. And I think in thinking about medicine, I really had to come to terms with the fact that it was certain that pain was there for a variety of reasons, some of them physical and some of them structural, but that I wasn't looking to narrate a kind of singular experience of that pain. So, among the complexities of this moment in which I was thinking, schistosomiasis was not the only disease that was associated with the construction of the dam. There were other parasitic diseases and also nutritional diseases. On top of that, this was a moment of incredibly hard labor, deep poverty, real challenges and violent encounters with the state. And so I think that when we think about pain as historians, we need to think about all of those questions, both embodied and also structural. And I think also sort of make ourselves comfortable with the fact that, at least for me, that my mission as a historian is not to describe a singular experience of that pain, but rather to describe the factors and the structures in which pain might have been experienced, right? And that was something that I wrestled through as I performed my research, because I think that one way that, well, there are a couple of ways that historians have approached that question. One way is, the conducting of oral history to sort of get a sense of that pain and how it might have functioned. Another is a more imaginative approach, which looks to kind of think with and imagine how these lives might have been lived. I think those are both great approaches. Those are just not my approaches, in the sense that, I'm looking to craft a historical narrative in which there's openness and the space for uncertainty, right? I'm not looking to kind of collapse experiences of pain into a singular narrative of pain.
I wonder how much that also has to do with the historical distance at which we are from the persons that you're talking about, and if there's an importance to having a space of openness and uncertainty for reasons that are related to historical distance. So maybe I could invite you to say a little bit more about how we can methodologically go about thinking through pain that is at a historical distance.
Yeah, I think that we have to think about that pain with uncertainty and with structural change. I think that's what I would say. It's interesting, this question of historical distance, because in my current book project about the liver, I'm not thinking at the same distance, right? So in terms of methodology, I've worked in a lot of archives. I've also conducted a number of oral histories. Now, as is the way when one is working in an authoritarian state, that's a tricky project, right? It's a tricky project. And so in a certain sense, that approach to methodology has been more limited than I would have liked. But one of the questions that I would ask is, I think that, many historians of medicine take for granted the categories that are proposed by medicine itself. And some of those categories are categories that delimit disease and our experience of disease. And, in my work, I really hope to push back against that and push back against those medical categories, in the sense that, I highlight this issue of economy and this question of geography and race, because there is no world in which those categories are also not central to experiences of pain, right? And so I think that part of my project is to sort of push medicine outside of the clean categories of the hospital and the clinic, and to think about, how bodies are situated in the world and what kinds of processes in the world cause that pain, right? And so archives often look to challenge that venture, right? They're organized in very particular ways that reflect our institutional categories of doing things. And so I think as historians, we have to challenge that differently, right? Both in thinking about the deep past and in thinking about pain as a more contemporary political issue, one that we can touch in a more proximate historical moment.
I wonder if I can bring some of this together. So if we're thinking about different third-person perspectives on bodily pain, there's going to be the third-person perspective of a kind of physician that is embedded in these categories of medicine. There's going to be a third-person perspective of the archive that is structured in a certain way, that is guided by certain categorical assumptions about whose evidence is worth keeping. And then it seems like you're advocating for a third way to be approaching pain from the third-person perspective through different categories as the historian, which are neither the received categories of the archive nor the received categories of medicine.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I also think that your emphasis on the third-person perspective is an important one, right? Because I think what we see, especially at the turn of the 19th century, is that patients are only allowed to exist in the third-person perspective, right? So obviously, that's not ideal. Obviously, a different kind of history would think with first-person testimonies of pain, first-person interviews. And I think that, in working now on a project that is more ethnographic, there's the opportunity to access that. But I think that that question of the third person, it's a real live and it's a real active one. And so how do we break down that category, I think is tricky, right? And so I think what I'm trying to do as a historian is to say the archive and physicians come with their particular attachments to power. And what we have to do is think more creatively about what the experience of that power might have been like. That comes up in all kinds of ways. I mentioned this question of photographs, and within the history of medicine, there's a very, very kind of active debate about whether it's ethical for historians to use photographs of patients that were almost certainly taken without their consent, photographs that are widely available. Many of the photographs that I saw and have seen in doing research are deeply intimate and show patients in very vulnerable positions. And so my position is that I will not show these photographs because I think there's a kind of violence that is implicit in display. That said, I am also describing a historical set of events that comes with intense violence. And so I've often wrestled with this question, is the violence not as tangible, is the critique not as strong unless I show the marks of this violence? So it's a very uneasy position, but I think that it really, those photographs and that they exist in such abundance, it really highlights this idea that patients, especially rural working class patients, historically in archives, they're really only allowed to exist in the third person from this variety of sources. And so what do we do with that? How do we deal with that responsibly as historians while also opening up spaces that allow us to imagine, although not singularly, what their lives might have been like?
Great. So maybe on the theme of trying to confront the violence that is so bound up with this project, I have a question from the audience that has the experience with liver disease prompted the government to publish more stringent regulations for patients' consent? What's the situation now?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think, there's a significant amount to be written about hepatitis specifically and what it says about questions of consent. So, one of the things that I commented on in the middle of my talk is that glass syringes and the lack of sterilization allowed the virus to spread, and there were all kinds of reasons that syringes weren't sterilized. That was true, right? So biomedical scientists and physicians had a pretty rudimentary understanding of how viruses worked in the middle decades of the 20th century. They also really kind of underplayed the damage of hepatitis in particular. So in the US and in Egypt, there are incidents of deliberate infection that happened in the US military and also with children who had been institutionalized in the United States. In Egypt, we see that happening, there's a kind of liberal use of prisoners and children as biomedical subjects. And so I think, what we see, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the most recent treatment campaign in Egypt is in some sense, it borrows the playbook of global public health in the middle decades of the 20th century. And what I mean by that is that the campaign itself is both this really commendable achievement in the sense that it has essentially rid the population of one of the biggest threats to its health, right? Something that would be unimaginable in the US. At the same time, the government has decided to use this kind of strategy of disease elimination rather than invest in the kind of regular structures of medicine, right? So there's still, when we think about the way that hospitals work in Egypt, there still is just a huge array of hospitals. There are hospitals that are private hospitals and in which one receives a very high standard of care, and in which the kinds of medical procedures attached to hepatitis one wouldn't even think about. That said, there are hospitals in which patients are asked to buy their own blood when they need a transfusion, in which syringes are still scarce. I find it sort of deeply disturbing that as syringes kind of spread throughout the globe as a biomedical technology, autoclaves and sterilization technology did not always spread with them. So what we see in Egypt is this kind of strategy to eliminate disease, but also this huge spectrum of how hepatitis is dealt with, especially regarding strategies of sterilization, depending on what kind of hospital you're at in the country.
So on this theme, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the way you're understanding the interaction, and here I'm channeling an audience question, between hepatitis C outbreak and treatment and recent political changes and upheavals in Egypt.
Yeah, this is a great question and a tricky one. The current regime in Egypt is deeply authoritarian. There are more political prisoners currently in Egypt than at any other point in its history, right? So it is nearly impossible to be a political dissident of any form in Egypt right now. And the government has cured hepatitis C, right? And so I think when we think with authoritarian states, there are tensions that we have to hold together, and those are deeply uncomfortable tensions. I want to say that in some ways, those tensions, I think, are more uncomfortable for academics than they maybe are for Egyptians, in the sense that it's not at all difficult for people to both complain about the repression that we see that is put in place by the government, and to say, we're glad there was a Hep C treatment campaign, right? So those two things can easily exist side by side. Is the fact that the regime authoritarian irrelevant to the implementation of a public health campaign? Of course it's not, right? So there were all kinds of legal maneuvers that were possible under an authoritarian state that required a kind of lack of consent and that existed with a particular degree of coordination that would not have been possible under a more democratic state, right? So I think, and this was a conversation that we talked a lot about in the sort of high days of COVID, like this relationship historically between public health and authoritarianism, it's a thorny one. There's a lot to say about that relationship.
There is a lot to say about that. We are running short on time, but I wonder, to pick up on a tension that you were just mentioning between what academics feel really bothered by and what you might be really bothered by on the ground. When we're thinking about the work that you're doing in this project, and as we were just talking about, finding these new categories as a historian to be thinking through bodily pain that aren't just the medical ones or the traditional ones of the archive, are you understanding that kind of work as having purchase on how we're understanding reality now? Or are you understanding this as a more academic-facing project?
That's a really good question. It is certainly the case that working on this book on liver disease has caused me to think long and hard about the complicated histories of global public health institutions, right? That's a really hard thing to say right now in this current political moment in the US. That said, if we want to think historically, we need to very, very much acknowledge that the history of global health, that is a history that has never been free of a kind of broader US foreign policy. It is a history that, whether we're talking about general development projects or pharmaceutical interventions, that has always been connected to the interests of chemical and pharmaceutical companies. And that's a tough thing to think with, right? I think that because I'm a historian, I can say that for me, it is necessary to think about global public health within the broader history of capitalism, right? We have used approaches within global health to solve for the inequities and the violence of capitalism, right? We see those things go hand in hand, and yet global public health is very much, in its way, connected to capitalist structures, right? And so I think that if we want to think intelligently about that history, and critically, we need to acknowledge that complicated history, because that is a history that people in other parts of the world very much think with, right? So that is the way that they have experienced organizations like the WHO. So sometimes it is the same organization that provides vital treatment that has also sponsored the dumping of large amounts of chemicals in their irrigation canals, right? So all of those things exist within that complicated history, and it certainly shapes my critiques of the contemporary moment as well as my more academic interventions.
Well, I would like to thank you, Jennifer, for helping us think intelligently about the past and present. Thank you to the audience for wonderful questions. I hope that you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos and past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you for joining us today, everyone.
Thank you.